All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Emma Fiddler, and I am the president of the Science Policy Network Detroit. And we're so excited to have you here with our wonderful guest speaker, Dr. Nicole Parker. Dr. Parker got her PhD from Johns Hopkins on biochemistry, and now she works in DC, right on the forefront of science policy, at the firm of Lewis and Burke. And we're so excited to have her. And I'm not going to give too much away. I'm going to let her take the reins here, but yeah, I'll just kind of thank you so much, Nicole, and hand it over to you.
Of course. Thank you for having me. It was really a joy of mine to host you all, and hopefully this is helpful for you guys. And of course, want to leave enough time for questions. So I'm gonna go through the slides probably a little bit quickly, but of course, if you have questions, please just let me know. So I wanted to start off and talk a little bit about me. And so I have a lot of pictures. So this is baby Nicole. But yeah, so baby Nicole was extremely good in science and math. When I was younger, I got to go across the street to the middle school to take pre-algebra because I was just like so advanced in math. So I always knew I was going to be a STEM girly, but didn't know what the career was going to look like. And so when I was in high school, I got to go to this boarding school, School of Science and Math. It was just like a bunch of kids. And that's the first time I did research. And then this is when I found out, like, oh, research is a career. Who knew? Because at the time, I think I only knew about medical doctors, like typical, folks. I knew, like, oh, you're good at science and math, you go get your MD. And so when I graduated, I had this new lease on life, and I was like, I'm going to go do research. I got to intern at the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences down in North Carolina, and to do my first, lab experience. And so I then went to the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, which it's like, oh, why would anyone go there? No one's ever heard of that school. Um, well, I went there particularly because I got to participate in this wonderful program called the Meyerhoff Scholarship Program. And for those of you all who haven't heard of it, it was really a program that was rooted in advancing underrepresented minorities in the research scientists. So, really trying to elevate people of color to move into PhD programs, which when it was created was not a typical track, right? Less than 1% women of color had received PhDs, trying to really advance that. And so through those 4 years, I went to my first research conference. This is like, I'm like right here. I don't know if you can see the pointer, but um, this was my first research conference, and I loved science. It was so fun. I was like, yes, I'm gonna go get my PhD. And my family was like, we don't know what that is, we just hope you make some money. And so I got to go to Johns Hopkins, and this is where I started my science policy journey. So at Johns Hopkins, I went to get my PhD in biochemistry, as Emma stated. But I also did a lot of exploration. So I would say, luckily, Johns Hopkins had the resources to kind of be on the frontier, I would say, of alternative careers, as they called them. I think they've shifted to non-academic careers now because, like, it's not so much alternative anymore, considering the funding environment. But at the time, it was alternative careers, and I like went to every single seminar. I was like, let me learn about patent law, let me learn about science. Right? I just like set in everything, and almost did like a process of elimination, um, and decided that I wanted to do policy. So I started to get really into advocacy. This is me and my Meyerhoff friends. We were at the March for Science, which I'm sure some of you might recall back in 2017, following a certain election, we felt the need to have a March for Science, and maybe we'll have another one. I don't know. History is repeating itself. And so, I was starting to complete my PhD program right on the cusp of a lot of advocacy in the science world and a lot of messaging about why science is important. So it was kind of the right time. And then I did the Merzion Fellowship. This is me and my cohort. And I'm happy to talk more about the Merzion Fellowship at the end of the presentation. But did that fellowship in 2016, was able to learn about the different sectors of policies over that 3 month and try to get more information about what I particularly wanted to do. Um, and now I'm working with Wayne State. So this is me with Patrick from the GR office, and of course, Esmanari, you all's new VPR, visiting Senator Peters' office, and then visiting the Office of Science and Department of Energy. So just wanted to kind of give you my trajectory, show you how I got there. Plus, loved digging up some of these old pictures because that was a lot of fun too. Um, but just really quick about where I am now. I'm at Lewis Burke Associates, full service government relations firm. I do lobby. I also do consulting, specifically in the NIH space, very focused on biomedical health with my career. But our firm itself is very focused on all the different entities within the federal government and very focused on advancing federal R&D and supporting our clients advance their research dollars. And so I know I'm here to kind of do a federal policy one-on-one. So gonna dive into that and first start off very simple, and breaking down the fact that we work with three branches of government, right? It's all about checks and balances, and that's the whole purpose of having the three branches. And so, in particular, I will say in my career as a lobbyist and a consultant, I largely work with the legislative and executive branch, and that is where you do see most policy creation occur. So, legislative branch, we like to say Congress has the power of the purse. They control all the spending dollars here in DC. Each year, Congress, sets forth funding for government agencies. It's something that you all advocated for when you came over the summer, having dollars for certain research programs, so on and so forth. And they're also in control of authorizing new programs and new policies that are important for you know, implementing new programs, or, if they want to put more controls on programs, they can do that as well. So a lot of power in Congress when they actually are able to pass things into law. And just a hint to you all, the last Congress was extremely unproductive in the fact that they were unable to pass a lot of laws just because of the nature of the Congress. And then, of course, we also have the executive branch. A lot of you all have probably been a benefit from funding from the executive branch if you were in any training programs or fellowship programs in your scientific career. And this is where all the agencies are. And it's just as important to engage with them as well. While they do not have the power of the purse, they do have the ability to kind of set their priorities. A lot of that, depending on the agency, can stem from, who's in power, right? With President Biden, we've seen a lot of interest in things like clean energy, health equity, moving away from natural gases, environmental justice, right? Like, and so with new administrations comes new priorities, and some agencies are very mission oriented, in which they might shift their priorities based on that. But then I will say there are some fundamental science agencies and some fundamental offices within agencies that really kind of stick to just fundamental science in general, regardless of who's in power. And so I would say like National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, an office like Office of Science within the Department of Energy. They're really focused on the fundamental parts of the science as advancing in the field, and it's less based on, who's in power, which is really good because, it can provide some consistency in the scientific field that we need, and we want to remain apolitical on. Of course, also there's judiciary branch, lots of courts at every level. Obviously, the Supreme Court gets the most, probably the most press, but there are lots of courts. There's district courts that are all kind of making decisions, and all those appointments run through the president and have to be confirmed by the Senate. So the courts are very important. I know, just to speak on, recent news with the overturning of the Chevron deference, the courts will become even more important because a lot of regulatory issues will now have to go to the court versus the agency being considered the expert in being able to implement the decision-making process for some regulatory processes. So I'll say we have yet to see the outcome of what will come from that, but I think you will see the courts used a lot more in the scientific system in the years to come. All right. So how is policy made? I don't know if any of you all know about Schoolhouse Rock, but this is a bill. um, I, used to love watching the cart. I'm not old enough to have seen Schoolhouse Rock in real time. I just want to say that, but I did see it later on. And so yeah, of how is what's a bill and what influences a bill. So, on the slide here you see the whole process of how the bill is passed, right? The bill is introduced. It can be introduced in the House or the Senate, but I think the most important thing to know is that it has to be introduced in both. Any bill that becomes law has to pass both bodies. And sometimes, we'll see something originate in the Senate, and sometimes we'll see it originate in the House, and sometimes they'll be working in a bicameral fashion to introduce it in both. Um, and usually, sometimes you have non-controversial bills that can pass on suspension, which means it'll be added to a calendar and basically it'll pass by a voice vote, meaning majority rules and everyone's fine with it. That's the process in the House. There's also a very similar process in the Senate where something's hotlined, and that's kind of similar to the suspension process, which it passes very quickly without any debate. Those are bills like renaming a post office, right? Renaming a military base. Very, very simple things. Um, but any bills, right, that are impacting a lot of the things that we do in the science space, science funding, right, or new authorizations to create new scientific programs. I think when you all were in DC, we talked about the NIH Improved program, like reauthorizing the legislation. Usually, things like that have to go through the process. So they'll be referred to a particular committee or subcommittee within the jurisdiction. And I have a slide of some committees that I'll share later. And then those committees will debate. Once the bill passes out of committee, then it has the opportunity to go to the floor. And there's a lot of other complicated things that control whether a bill goes to the floor or not. That has to do with the amount of days that are left on the legislative calendar or what's taking priority. But depending on the bill and depending on what's the priority of the Congress, what we hope would happen is that it would go through committee, pass committee, go to the floor, pass the floor in both chambers, and then goes to the president and is signed into law. But I think what's important to note is that there are lots of things that influence bills, including people like me who are at lobbying firms. We have, the administration weighs in on bills. So most recently, just to give a very recent example, President Biden sent a letter to Capitol Hill recommending all the disaster relief aid that's needed. They sent a bill text over and said we need $100 billion to support all of the people impacted by the past two hurricanes that created a lot of damage in the country. So the administration can influence a bill. Constituents can influence a bill, right? You all are constituents of the state of Michigan, District 13. You all are able to go to the Hill, influence a bill. Also, think tanks like the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, they often release reports. They can weigh in on, how a bill should be structured. But nonetheless, I just want to say there's a lot of different influences that can make or break a bill. And there usually are lots of opportunities to weigh in. I lost my mouse. Okay, here we go. All right, and so mechanisms to make policy. So, just starting with the president, a lot of policies do have to go to Congress, but the president does have latitude to make some policy changes when it comes to the appointments that they make, right? So we're seeing a lot of cabinet position decisions come out. The people in those roles will be very influential on how agencies operate and how the administration operates. They also have the authority to release executive directives. So, most presidents release a lot of executive orders. And really, it's a workaround for things that they know won't pass through Congress, right? And so they're limited in that. And it's, they can be really beneficial, but then at the same time, as soon as that president is out of office, all of that is kind of pulled back, right? So, for in the scientific space, I'll say like there's an executive order on AI that's out right now. There's an executive order for women's health research, executive order for health equity. So that there's some things, right? They're all in executive order, and they all likely will be pulled back day one of a new administration, and then there'll be new executive orders. But this is a way that the president can make their own policies and can influence agencies to kind of do what is a part of their initial mission. Also, executive branch offices. So sometimes you'll see the Office of Management and Budget, which is what OMB stands for, issue out memorandums and circulars to try to say, like, this is what we're doing now. All the agencies need to get in line. And that can be related to anything. And it's really a way to make sure all the agencies are working together for a common goal. Agencies also, while they do not make policy, they are the bodies that interpret policy. And so, for, I would say, good reason, sometimes laws that come down from Congress there's a lot of room for interpretation. And it's because they give agencies a bit of latitude to interpret it the way they see fit. Congress, members are not experts in all of these different fields, right? They cannot be as prescriptive as they probably would like to be because they don't know how things fully operate at the agency level. But they can give guidance for what they want to see, and the agency can take that guidance and figure out how they're going to interpret it. So oftentimes, the way you'll see, agencies, sometimes they'll just interpret laws, but oftentimes they might reach out and ask for people to weigh in, right? So we'll see requests for information that come out from agencies. Sometimes agencies will go through the rulemaking process. You see that with like a lot of regulations at the FDA or at the Department of Education, in which they give stakeholders the opportunity to weigh in on how something should be implemented, that would be best for the community. So I think what's important about a lot of these sectors is that they're doing their best not to do it alone, right? Like, we are not in a dictatorship. This is a democracy. And so I think at all of these stages, there are oftentimes a lot of opportunities to weigh in and lend your voice to policy making. We kind of talked about Congress already on the last slide, but like I said, bills, laws. There's also report language that is attached to like appropriation spending bills that can influence how dollars are spent. They're able to create new things. Congress really has the most power, so to speak, out of all the bodies. When they're operating correctly, they really can do a lot with their oversight. And then again, judiciary, they are all about interpreting laws and determining what's constitutional and what's not. And so sometimes we see a lot of things also move through the court. And then, I think oftentimes what you hope is if something keeps going to the court, there might be a need to revisit the law or create some type of law to fix whatever problem is continuously going to the court. And so a lot of times, right, we'll see redistricting cases go to the court, right? Well, if we want to fix redistricting in states, maybe we need to have something that goes through Congress to kind of set what should be, creating congressional districts. That's just an example, but that's something that goes to the court a lot. And I think people would like to see some legislation on it, but we probably never will. So all right. So how does Congress make policy? So I think, this is the body that I would say I work with the most. And so just wanted to dive in to kind of talk a bit more about, the two main methods they use for creating policy. So that's authorization, which, doesn't require any funds. It's kind of like with the NIH Improved program. They wanted this program to continue. They wanted to authorize funding for it, but at the end of the day, that is not real money. It's just a suggestion. And then there's the Appropriations Committee, which really is a target for most people's advocacy because that's where you get the dollars. And at the end of the day, everyone just wants money. And so there's various examples of committees, House and Senate side. I'll say there's a counterpart basically for every committee in the House and the Senate. And the ones listed here, I think, are the ones that likely fit in more with what you all care about on campus and within this group. So education and work, I should say workforce, my apologies. Education and Workforce Committee, which has jurisdiction over the Department of Labor and Department of Education. Pell Grants, I think that's something that a lot of people have benefited from. Energy and Commerce Committee, which has a jurisdiction over the NIH. They have jurisdiction over FDA, Department of Energy, as the name suggests. And then, also they have jurisdiction over Medicaid, which is something I had to learn when I started this job. um, and another committee is Ways and Means, which is, kind of like the finance body. They have jurisdiction over Social Security and Medicare, many of the entitlement programs that are funded by the federal government, and of course, Science, Space, and Technology Committee. They have jurisdiction kind of over NSF and are really focused on a lot of research initiatives like AI. And those same similar committees are in the Senate committee. Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions is kind of like a combination of education and workforce and energy and commerce. They are very focused on HHS and education, labor, and then also the Finance Committee is very similar to Ways and Means, in which they're interested in Medicare and entitlement programs. Commerce, Science, and Transportation is very clear. Department of Commerce, NSF, and Department of Transportation. They are very focused on those three things. And Environment and Public Works is another committee in the Senate, which is kind of focused on EPA, Department of Interior. Think about like clean water, things of that nature. They would be focused on those areas. And then by nature, the Appropriations Committee is one committee in the House and in the Senate, but there are 12 subcommittees, and each subcommittee is over their own bill. And so I think when you all were in town, we spent a lot of time doing advocacy on the Labor, Health, and Human Services Education Bill because that is where NIH dollars are funded through. And then also the Commerce, Justice, Science, and Related Agencies Committee, that bill is what funds the NSF. So there's also the Department of Interior bill, which funds the EPA. So there's the exact same 12 subcommittees are in the House and the Senate. And in a perfect world, they work together to finalize appropriations to fund the government every single fiscal year. And so I wanted to give you all a sense of calendar timeline with the appropriations process because it really truly is one of the most important processes we have on Capitol Hill to push advocacy for the programs we care about. And I want to stress that this is ideal and this is not normal. So normally, like ideally, I don't want to say normal. Ideally, you would get the president's budget in February. The president's budget would kind of say like, this is what I want to see. These are the programs I want to invest in. It's really the president's wish list. And then around March, April, Congress will see the president's wish list and say, okay, cool, great. If I'm aligned with your party, I'm like, yes, let's put this in the bill. If I'm not, I'm like, I don't care what you want. I'm going to write my own bill. So right now we're moving into a year where there's unified government in which Republicans control every single body. So we can probably anticipate whatever President-elect Trump's first budget request will be taken seriously, and there might actually be some of that implemented into appropriation bills. March and April bills, they'll start to work on bills. That's often when you see a lot of hearings happening, federal agencies coming to the Hill talking about their priorities, telling Congress like, we need this money because XYZ. And then in May and June, they'll start to mark up the bills, push the bills through. The bills will have to go through subcommittee first, and then they'll go to the full appropriations committee. And once things pass through the full appropriations committee, they're ready to be sent to the other chamber. And usually what happens is the House passes all their bills, they pass them all through the full appropriations committee. Then the Senate does the same. And then you would hope they conference them together to come to a agreement on what the final bills will be, and then they'll pass them through Congress and send them to the president. And all of that is supposed to happen by September 30th so they can fund the next fiscal year. But I will say, I don't know the last time that happened by September 30th. We have been dealing in an environment in which continuing resolutions are normal. We are operating in a continuing resolution right now, and these things can be kicked down the road, and especially when we're dealing with a change in administration that does threaten the process of kicking it down the road even more. Um, at the bottom of the slide, you can kind of see how university would engage throughout this process. Oftentimes, as a campus, you would want to influence the bill before, right around that February timeframe, so you can get to people before they start to write the bills. And then, if your requests are in, it's important to continue to engage the delegation so your priorities kind of make it to the end. And so it's a constant engagement process. I think because the timeline has altered, I would say, a bit. It's you're just always constantly telling people what's important to you because you don't know when things are going to wrap up and you don't know when things are going to start again. So it's a really interesting process these days. Okay, so moving on, just want to quickly touch on how executive branch can impact policy. So we talked a lot about Congress. I think we talked about, there's federal agencies, the Office of Management and Budget, and the president. They work on this president's budget request every year, and it has the president's policy priorities there. It also has the federal agency priorities. So oftentimes we'll see a huge president's budget request come out, but also agencies release their own budget request. They're aligned with what the president wants, but they're also aligned just with their general mission as well. And although they might not come true, it does give you good insight into what the agency priorities are. So it's just a good place to look at, what the agency feels is important at the moment. And I think as, people are chasing funding opportunities and trying to figure out how to make maybe their research more attractive to funding, it's good to see what the agency is interested in. And then also the administration, as I said earlier, can sign executive orders to kind of push the trends of agencies. I just wanted to share, I'm not going to read this slide, but I just wanted to also share each year the administration releases their R&D priorities. These usually come out like August. So like fiscal year 2025 R&D priorities came out in August 2023. So they come out before the fiscal year 2025 budget request, which usually will come out the next year. And it just gives you an insight on what the president and the administration wants to focus on in the R&D landscape. The memo for fiscal year 2026 never came out. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that obviously President Biden wasn't continuing, and you know, Vice President Harris never really had the time to, this is not something she had the time to work on as she was trying to quickly run. So we don't have them for this year, but typically it gives you good insight on what the administration priorities are. And oftentimes you'll see like whatever priorities are listed in this in this priorities list reflected in the president's budget request. And then this is just the highlights from the fiscal year 2025 budget request that was released in March of this year, which is a little bit after February, but not too much after. Um, and then it kind of shows you, I just have a graph here that shows like the increases and the decreases in funding. So, increases at NIH, NSF, DOE, less at Homeland Security, so like, you can just see like, okay, this is what the priorities are. This is, where not so much. And one thing that's important about this particular budget request is that just to get in the policy weeds a little bit, I will say, in 2023, we had to figure out a way to move forward on the debt ceiling. And so we signed into law the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which enforced budget caps. And then anytime you're in a budget capped environment, you don't see a lot of growth at any agency. And I'll say that President Biden marked up his president's budget request to those budget caps, which is why we don't see basically increases across the board. Because if it's a wish list, you're going to do what you want. But he was extremely responsible by marking this up to the caps, and so that's why you kind of see some decreases in some areas, which is important to know because you don't want to think that like, oh, he doesn't care about NOAA research. Like that's crazy. No, like I think there's priorities there, but you had to make some sacrifices. And then following the president's budget request, as he said, like, usually appropriations happens, and just wanted to share where we are right now so you guys have a landscape of what's happening. Um, we saw modest growth from the president budget request, and due to those fiscal caps, we also have seen very little growth in the House or the Senate bills. So all these different colors just indicate, this light color at the top is the fiscal year 2025 Senate number. This one underneath is the House number. This is the president's budget request, and this is what was enacted in 2024. And as you can see from most agencies, it's pretty stagnant, which would be expected in this fiscal capped environment. But this is why, in the House bill, we saw a lot of report language, which included a lot of very partisan policy writers. So when you can't move money around a lot, you see a lot of members of Congress try to make their influence just by report language and emphasizing what should and shouldn't be supported at certain agencies. So currently, the funding landscape is very stagnant. The fiscal year ended on September 30th. This continuing resolution we're on goes through December 20th. And really, Republicans hold the fate of appropriations right now. That's kind of where we are right now. It could be completed in December or it could be kicked into March. Hard to say. The Senate bills that were released were bipartisan, the House bills were not. And so we're still waiting on them to even start conference negotiations. And so we're in a very much so wait and see moment still for appropriations. And this is where we are now. And I hope this is helpful. That was my last slide. Wanted to kind of walk through the process, but then also kind of tell you where we are now in this process. So I'm going to send these slides. I'll take out the picture slide because you guys don't need all those pictures of me, but I'll send the other slides over to you all so you can have them as a resource to walk through. And of course, my email and LinkedIn are on this thank you slide as well. So happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you so much. That was like a fantastic overview. I feel like I've listened to a lot of talks about science policy and I learn something new every single time that I do it. So that was great. Thank you.
Of
Um,
course.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and then we can get to the Q&A.